Essential question, Lesson 23, what is the role of the President in the American constitutional system? And Lesson 24, how are national laws administered in the American constitutional system? Students will be able to. Lesson 23, explain the President's constitutional responsibilities and how the office of the President has evolved. Identify various constitutional and political checks on the President's power. Evaluate, take, and defend positions on issues involving the exercise of presidential power and the relationship between the President and other branches of government. Lesson 24, explain why Congress creates administrative units, the circumstances that contribute to their creation, and the range of government function that administrative units perform. Florida standards. We're going to analyze the structures, functions, and processes of the executive branch as described in Article 2 of the Constitution. Key vocabulary: Commander-in-Chief, Executive Order, Executive Power, Bureaucracy, Cabinet, Civil Service, Independent Agencies, and Patronage. What are the President's constitutional responsibilities? So the President's going to be in charge of a lot of things as outlined in Article 2. So he's Commander-in-Chief of the military. He's going to be the head executive of departments, so he's going to make sure that laws are being enforced. He can grant reprieves or postponements of punishments and grant pardons, which means that he can basically lessen jail sentences. He can make treaties at the consent and advice of the Senate. He can nominate ambassadors, public ministers, counsels, and judges of the Supreme Court and other federal courts. He can recommend legislation to Congress. He can review legislation by Congress and either sign into law or return bills that the President rejects. We call these vetoes. And he can receive ambassadors and public ministers from foreign countries. So how do the framers envision the presidency? So the president is supposed to be above partisan politics. The president was not to be in the muck of political bickering. And was not supposed to be devoted to any type of political party. That's all going to come out in the late 1790s after George Washington's president. George Washington is the only president really to be absent from a political party. Federalist 68 is going to suggest that a president is to be a person who has earned esteem and confidence of the entire nation. So it's someone who should be someone of outstanding character. And the Electoral College was designed to help find someone of who is preeminent for ability and for virtue. Okay, again, someone who is outside of what we call mainstream people, I guess. So someone who is just upfront and very outstanding, someone of good character and good merit. They did not want a president to have the same powers as a monarch. Okay, we went through that in Federalist 69, where we're comparing what Hamilton would call the character of the president, and he's going to compare that to a king and a monarch. So in that Federalist paper, a king is definitely going to be seen as someone who is above the law, but at the same time, he is also suggesting that the president just is going to have powers, but isn't going to have full absolute power like a king would. So he's going to have checks and balances on him, and he's going to be someone that is not above the law. So what's the president's role in foreign policy? So he is in command of the armed forces. He can make treaties, but he cannot enforce treaties. That has to be recognized by the Senate through the advise and consent part. He can appoint ambassadors and councils. He can receive ambassadors and other public ministers. And he can also recognize other countries' existence as well. George W. Bush did this. There's a small little country in southeastern Europe. This region is called the Balkans, and there's a really small country that's separated from another country called Serbia, and this country is called Kosovo. Kosovo has been recognized by the United States under George W. Bush as a sovereign right to exist country. Other countries of the world, like Russia, have not recognized this country's right to exist, but the president does have that power. So, how do the president's power expand in war and also emergency? So, during wars and emergencies, the president can exercise powers not granted in the Constitution. This is going to be tested by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War because he believes that the Constitution does give him certain war powers. So, he is going to stretch the Constitution pretty far into how far the president can use his war powers. FDR is going to do it in World War II. Currently, the President Trump is using these types of war powers, instructing the military for border security. There's always been a question if the president can and cannot do that per the Constitution, but with most of these presidents, they have used these war powers, and they have been very, very effective by using these war powers. So, how and why has presidential power expanded historically? So, authority has shifted from the legislative branch to the executive branch over the course of the past 200 years. During the 1800s, Congress was the dominant power, and then in the 1900s, especially after Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt is really going to do a huge power grab from Congress and basically give it to himself, where it's going to be stay the whole entire time. And the president has gained more and more power since then. So some reasons why the president has gained more power is, well, Americans have always expected their chief executive to act vigorously and address the nation's problems. Constitutional authority is stated in broad terms, not specific terms. The president can recommend legislation. Presidents usually do have an agenda, especially during the State of the Union addresses. The use of executive orders, which does give the president lawmaking power if the president knows through divided government that he's going to have a hard time trying to get his legislative agenda passed through Congress, he can just issue an executive order, and then he's just going to see if the courts are going to let him have that or not. He's going to also assume responsibilities that was seen to be a local or state issue or regulated by individuals. So what the American people have done over time is that they've basically reacted to this one central authority, and power has been centralized with the president. This was never the intent. This is just how the presidency has evolved over 200 years. So how are presidential powers limited? So Congress can check the exercise of the president by rejecting president's legislative agenda or modifying it in ways that make it unacceptable to the president. They are able to do that. There's going to be some compromise, some give and take when it comes to that. Asserting its constitutional authority, like with the War Powers Act of 1973, Congress has the authority to declare war. The president does not. And under this War Powers Act in 1973, it was vetoed by Nixon, but then Congress overrode that presidential veto. So what that forces the president to do is that he can still send troops anywhere in the world for 100 days without authorization of Congress, but after those 100 days, he has to seek some type of authorization, whether it be through a declaration of war or through appropriations of spending. They can refuse to ratify treaties. This happened with Woodrow Wilson in 1919 after World War I. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States Senate rejected it. We had to have our own treaty with Germany that officially ended our involvement in World War I in 1920. They can refuse to confirm presidential nominees in the judiciary. This has happened with several presidents before. Most notably was Ronald Reagan had a couple of Supreme Court nominees that were rejected by the Senate. Refusing to fund the president's programs, and they can also remove the president from office through impeachment. Even though we've had 2 presidents impeached, none of them have been removed from office. What kinds of administrative units exist in the American national government? So executive departments, there's 15 primary administrative units. We call these the cabinet. George Washington had 4, and over time it's been expanded. The most recent one's the Department of Homeland Security, and that was added in 2002. The Executive Office of the President, some people call this the EOP, the White House Office, Homeland Security Staff, the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, and the Office of the United States Trade representatives. These are all what we call the executive branch, and what they do is that they do help through the EOP, help the president enforce law. Okay. What Congress has done is that they've given a lot of congressional power to the EOP in order to enforce law, and Congress has basically said, hey, if whatever type of regulations you come up with, we will support you. Basically, what Congress has done is that they have given legislative power to the executive office of the president, the executive branch, in order to make up laws they go. And then and Congress has given them that authority, and the American people have to obey it. Independent agencies, they're located outside the structure of the executive branch, and Congress has created these agencies, and even though the president is the boss of these agencies, technically it's under the authorization of Congress, and this is like the post office and NASA. So, what factors have contributed to the number of administrative organizations? So, the executive departments, Congress directs each department to administer particular laws, and the president appoints secretaries that serve on the president's cabinet. But these secretaries have to be confirmed by the Senate. Okay, so there is going to be an advice and consent element with these executive departments. The EOP, Executive Office of the President, they help with budgeting, personnel management, and natural resources planning as well. When it comes to the budgeting part, there's an office in the President called the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. The OMB director is under the advice and consent of the Senate as well, and they have to be confirmed as well. And they're the ones who are going to be basically proposing the budget to be approved by Congress. Again, Congress has the power of the purse. The President just cannot go out and spend whatever he wants to spend money on. Okay, he has to propose a budget to Congress, and Congress has to approve of that budget and then allocate that money. We also have independent agencies, and they implement congressional statutes like the post office. All right, so how do checks and balances affect administrative agencies? So the president uses their appointment power to reward political loyalists and advance their policy agendas. Some people will call this the spoil system. Through administrative agencies, they are staffed through the Civil Service Program. The Civil Service Program is going to be established in the 70s, and there's a exam that people have to take, and then the Civil Service Department will find a place for that person based on their talents. Congress is responsible for the creation and the elimination of administrative agencies. Congress giveth, Congress can take it away. And then courts can decide whether agency operations follow the 14th Amendment's requirements of due process and equal protection. There's also an element of federalism, and also citizens, interest groups, and the media can also provide a check and balance on them through what we call the Iron Triangle. And we'll talk about the Iron Triangle in class.